The Velthari Empire had conquered 11 star systems in less than 10 years, and no species had ever stopped them from taking what they wanted. And Empress Azara had ruled her people for over 1,000 years, and she had never known defeat, and she had never known fear, and she believed that she never would. Flagship was called the Eternal Dominion, and it was the largest ship ever built by her kind, and it carried enough weapons to destroy entire planets and enough soldiers to conquer any world. And now it hung in the darkness of space above a small blue planet called Ursifara. Sat upon her throne made of black crystal, and she watched the planet grow larger on her viewing screen, and she smiled because she knew that this conquest would be easy and fast, and soon these creatures called humans would kneel before her like all the others had knelt. She had studied the humans for many months, and she knew everything about them, and she knew that they were weak and soft, and that they lived short lives, and that they fought each other constantly over small things. And she knew that they had only recently learned to travel between stars, and they were like children compared to her ancient empire. Begin the broadcast, she commanded, and her voice echoed through the great chamber where 100 of her advisors stood waiting on Earth. Every television screen flickered, and every radio crackled, and every phone and computer showed the same image, and 8 billion humans stopped what they were doing and looked at the pale, angular face of Empress Readied as she spoke to them. "People of Earth," she said in perfect English, because her translators had done their work well. "I am Empress Readied of the Velthari. Dominion in your world now belongs to us, and you have 72 hours to surrender, and if you do not surrender, then your cities will burn, and your people will suffer, and there is nothing you can do to stop this, because we have studied your weapons and your armies, and you cannot hurt us, and you cannot fight us, and you will kneel." The transmission ended, and silence fell across the world for just a moment, and then the chaos began in Washington. The president called an emergency meeting, and generals shouted at each other, and politicians demanded answers that nobody had, and in Moscow and Beijing and London and Paris the same scenes played out as leaders tried to understand what they could do against an enemy that had conquered 11 worlds. Missiles were launched within the first hour, and fighter jets scrambled into the sky, and the bravest soldiers on Earth prepared to defend their home, but the missiles exploded harmlessly against shimmering shields that surrounded the alien ships, and the fighter jets were swatted from the sky like insects, and nothing that humanity could even scratch the enemy. In a small apartment in Chicago, a man named Danny Reyes sat on his old couch and watched the news, and he saw the missiles fail, and he saw the jets fall, and he saw the terror on the faces of the reporters, and he felt something cold settle in his chest. Danny was 34 years old, and he worked as a mechanic fixing cars and trucks, and he was not special in any way that he knew of. And he was not a soldier, and he was not a scientist, and he was just a man who went to work every day and came home every night to his daughter. His daughter was named Lily, and she was 7 years old, and she had her mother's eyes and her mother's smile. And her mother had died 3 years ago from a sickness that the doctors could not cure, and Danny had raised Lily alone ever since, and she was everything to him, and he would do anything to protect her. Lily came into the room, and she climbed into his lap, and she looked at the television where the alien Empress was speaking again and warning humanity that time was running out. "Daddy," Lily said in her small voice, "are the aliens going to hurt us?" Danny looked down at his daughter, and he saw the fear in her eyes, and he wanted to lie to her and tell her that everything would be fine, but he had never lied to her before, and he did not want to start now. Something strange happened when he opened his mouth to speak, and instead of fear, he felt something else rising up inside him, and it was something old and fierce, and it came from a place deep within him that he did not know existed. "No, sweetheart," he said, and his voice was steady and calm. "They are not going to hurt us." "How do you know, Daddy?" Danny looked at the window where the sky was growing dark, and he could see the shapes of alien ships descending through the clouds, and they were massive and terrifying, and they blocked out the stars, and they should have made him feel hopeless, but they did not, because we are human, he said, and humans do not give up. He did not know where those words came from, and he did not know why he believed them, but he did believe them with all his heart. And he held his daughter close, and he watched the ships descend, and he felt no fear across the world. Other humans were feeling the same thing, and they did not know each other, and they did not speak to each other, but they all felt the same fire burning inside them, and it was a fire that had burned in human hearts since the first human had picked up a rock and decided to fight instead of run. Valkyrie had studied humanity for months, and they had learned many things, and they knew about human weapons and human governments and human technology. But they had missed something important, and they had missed the one thing that made humans different from every other species. They had conquered. They had missed the human spirit empress. Zither sat upon her throne, and she watched her ships descend toward the planet. And she felt certain of victory, because she had won 11 times before, and she would win again. But she did not know about Danny Reyes, sitting in his small apartment in Chicago, and she did not know about the millions of other humans who were feeling that same strange fire burning inside them, and she did not know that she had made a terrible mistake. She had come to conquer a planet, but she had awakened something far more dangerous than she could imagine. The first day of the invasion was ending, and the sun was setting over Chicago, and Danny put his daughter to bed and kissed her forehead and told her that everything would be okay. And then he walked to the window and looked up at the alien ships hanging in the sky. "You think you know U.S.," he whispered to the darkness, "but you do not know anything." And somewhere deep in his heart, the fire burned brighter, and he knew that tomorrow he would do something, and he did not know what it was yet, but he knew that he could not simply wait and watch and let these invaders take his world and threaten his daughter. He was just one man, and he was not special, and he was not a hero, but he was human, and that would have to be enough. The second day began with fire in the sky as the Valkyrie landing ships descended upon every major city on Earth, and the alien soldiers marched out in perfect formations, wearing armor that gleamed like polished metal and carrying weapons that could turn a man to ash in an instant. Danny Reyes woke before dawn, and he made breakfast for Lily, and he tried to act normal, but his hands were shaking, and his mind was racing, and he knew that he could not simply sit in his apartment and wait for the aliens to come for them. "Lily," he said as she ate her cereal, "I need to take you to Aunt Maria today, and you need to stay with her for a little while." "Why, Daddy?" "Because I have something important to do." Lily looked at him with her big eyes, and she was only 7 years old. But she was smart, and she understood more than Danny realized, and she nodded slowly. "You are going to fight the aliens," she said. Danny knelt down beside her, and he took her small hands in his, and he looked into her eyes. "I am going to try to help," he said, "and I need you to be brave for me, and I need you to stay safe, and I promise you that I will come back." "Do you promise, Daddy?" "I promise, sweetheart." He drove Lily to his sister Maria's house in the suburbs, and Maria hugged him tight and told him to be careful, and Danny kissed his daughter one more time, and then he got back in his truck and drove toward downtown Chicago. He did not know where he was going at first, but then he saw a sign outside an old veterans hall, and it said, "Meeting tonight for all who want to fight," and Danny parked his truck and walked inside. The hall was full of people, and there were hundreds of them packed into a room meant for 50, and they were all different kinds of people, and there were old soldiers and young students and teachers and nurses and construction workers and accountants, and they had all come because they could not simply wait and do nothing. At the front of the room stood a man with gray hair and steel in his eyes, and his name was Pete Dawson, and he was a retired Marine colonel who had served in 3 wars, and he had seen things that would break most men, but he was not broken. "I know what you are all thinking," Pete said, and his voice carried across the room. "You are thinking that we cannot win, and you are thinking that our weapons are useless against them. And you are right about that, because we cannot fight them the way we fight normal enemies. Someone in the crowd shouted out, "Then what is the point of this meeting?" "The point," Pete said, "is that we are going to find another way, and we are going to fight them in ways they do not expect, and we are going to make them bleed. They might not even have blood." Another voice called out, and some people laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. "Then we find out what they have, and we take it from them." Pete replied. Danny stood in the back of the room, and he listened, and he felt that fire burning inside him again, and before he knew what he was doing, he pushed through the crowd and walked to the front of the room, and every eye turned to look at him. He was not a soldier, and he was not a leader, and he was just a mechanic from Chicago. But something made him step forward, and something made him speak. "I am in," he said simply. The room went quiet, and Pete Dawson looked at him and nodded slowly. "What is your name, son?" "Danny Reyes." "What do you do, Danny Reyes?" "I fix cars and trucks and engines, and if it has moving parts, I can figure out how it works." Pete smiled, and it was the first real smile Danny had seen since the invasion began. "We are going to need people like you," Pete said, "because we are going to need to figure out how their machines work, and then we are going to break them." One by one, other people stepped forward and said their names and said what they could do. And there was a young woman named Grace, Kim, who was studying physics, and there was an old man named Howard Bell, who used to teach chemistry, and there was a nurse named Linda Santos who could treat wounds, and there were dozens of others with skills that might be useful by the end of the meeting. They had formed a plan, and it was a simple plan, but it was the only plan they had, and the plan was to learn everything they could about the enemy, and then find their weaknesses. "They think we are primitive," Pete said as the meeting ended, "and they think we will roll over and surrender, but they do not understand what they are dealing with, and we are going to teach them." That night, Danny and a small team went out into the city, and they moved through the shadows, and they watched the alien patrols, and they studied how the soldiers moved and how their weapons worked, and they took notes on everything they saw. They found a crashed alien drone in an alley, and somehow a bullet had hit it in just the right spot and knocked it out of the sky, and they carried it back to their hideout, and they pulled it apart piece by piece. Grace studied the technology, and her eyes went wide as she began to understand how it worked. "Their shields are amazing," she said. "They can stop bullets and missiles and almost any kind of fast attack. But look at this." She showed them the readout she had managed to pull from the drone systems. "The shields are calibrated to stop things moving at high speeds. But if something moves slowly enough, it might pass right through." Howard, the chemistry teacher, leaned forward, and his old eyes sparkled with something dangerous. "I have an idea," he said, "and you are not going to like it, but it might work." He explained his idea, and Danny listened, and he was right that they did not like it, but they all agreed that it might be their only chance. The humans were learning, and the Valkyrie had no idea what was coming. Howard Bell had spent 40 years teaching chemistry to high school students, and most of those students had thought chemistry was boring. But Howard knew the truth, and the truth was that chemistry was dangerous and beautiful and powerful. His idea was simple but terrible, and he explained it to the group in the basement of the Veterans Hall while alien ships flew overhead. "Their shields stop fast things," he said, "but they cannot stop slow things like gas. And I know how to make a gas that will eat through almost anything. And if we can get it close to them, it will go right through their shields and melt their armor." Grace looked worried. "That sounds like a war crime," she said. "It would be a war crime if we were fighting humans," Pete replied. "But we are not fighting humans, and the rules do not apply anymore, because if we lose this fight, there will be no one left to judge us." Danny thought about Lily, and he thought about the world she would grow up in if the aliens won, and he made his decision. "Tell us what you need, Howard." Howard made a list of chemicals, and most of them could be found in ordinary places, like hardware stores and farms and factories. And the team split up and went out into the city to gather everything they needed by midnight. They had enough materials, and Howard worked through the night mixing and measuring and creating something that no human had ever made before, and it was a gas that moved slowly but destroyed everything it touched. We need to test it. Pete said they found a piece of Veltri armor that had been left behind after a battle, and they set it up in an abandoned warehouse, and they released a small amount of the gas, and they watched the gas drifted slowly toward the armor, and when it touched the surface, the metal began to bubble and hiss, and within minutes, there was a hole in the armor that grew larger and larger. It works, Grace whispered. Now we need to use it. Danny said the first attack happened at 11:47 that night, and Danny was there, and he would never forget what he saw. A Veltri soldier stood guard outside a forward operating base on the edge of the city, and his name was Crix, though the humans did not know that, and he was 47 years old, and he had a family waiting for him back home, and he thought this conquest would be easy like all the others. The gas came drifting through the darkness, and Crix did not see it coming because it was invisible, and it made no sound, and his shields did nothing to stop it because it moved so slowly. It passed through his shield like the shield was not there, and it found a tiny crack in his armor that had been made by an explosion earlier that day, and it seeped inside, and it filled his lungs. Crix tried to scream, but he could not, and he fell to the ground, and his body twisted and convulsed, and then he was still the first Veltri soldier died on Earth that night, and he would not be the last. Word spread quickly through the human resistance, and the method was shared with other groups in other cities, and soon the attacks were happening everywhere. In New York, a team released gas into a Veltri barracks and killed 30 soldiers. As they slept in Los Angeles, humans used the gas to destroy alien vehicles and tanks. In Houston, they found that the gas could eat through the armor of the smaller ships, and they brought one crashing down from the sky. The Veltri did not understand what was happening, and their soldiers began to feel something they had never felt before, and that something was fear. Commander Vorath reported to Empress Readied on the morning of the third day, and his voice was not as confident as it had been before. We have lost 117 soldiers, he said, and 43 more are wounded, and 2 of our ships have been damaged. Readied stared at him. That is impossible, she said. These humans cannot hurt us. They found a way, Empress, and they are using chemical weapons that pass through our shields, and they are learning and adapting faster than any species we have ever conquered. Readied stood from her throne and walked to the viewing screen, and she looked down at the planet below, and for the first time, she felt a small seed of doubt growing in her heart. Show me the reports, she demanded. Vorath showed her everything, and she saw the videos of her soldiers dying, and she saw the images of her ships falling, and she saw the messages that humans were sending to each other across their primitive networks, and she saw something else that confused her. She saw that the humans were not afraid. They should have been afraid because they were dying too, and many of them were dying, but instead of fear, their messages were full of something else, and it was something she did not understand, and the word they used was hope. What is wrong with these creatures? She whispered. In Chicago, Danny Rice had not slept in 2 days, but he did not feel tired because the fire inside him was burning too bright, and he stood with his team in their hideout, and they planned their next attack. We are hurting them, Pete said, but we are not winning yet, and we need to do more. What else can we do? Linda asked. We are just ordinary people. Danny looked at her, and he smiled. That is exactly what we are, he said. And that is why we are going to win, because they expected to fight soldiers and governments and armies. But instead, they are fighting mechanics and teachers and nurses and students. And they do not know how to stop us because we are everywhere. Grace had been working on the captured drone, and she looked up with excitement in her eyes. I found something, she said. Their communication system has a weakness, and I think I can hack into it. What would that do? Pete asked. It would let us listen to everything they say, and it would let us know where they are going before they get there. Danny felt the fire burn brighter. Do it. He said the humans were not just fighting back anymore, they were winning. Empress Zidara had lived for over 1,000 years, and in that time, she had conquered 11 star systems and destroyed countless enemies, and she had never once considered the possibility that she might lose. But now on the third day of the invasion of Earth, she sat upon her throne, and she felt something she had not felt in centuries, and it was the cold touch of doubt. The reports kept coming, and each one was worse than the last 200 soldiers dead, and the number was growing every hour. 5 ships damaged and one completely destroyed when humans had somehow gotten explosives inside of the communications network was compromised, and the humans were listening to everything her commanders said, and, worst of all, her soldiers were afraid she had seen the fear in their eyes when they returned from patrols, and she had heard the fear in their voices when they reported contact with the enemy. And these were warriors who had conquered 11 worlds, and now they were afraid to walk the streets of human cities. How is this possible? She demanded. These creatures have no advanced technology and no real military power, and they should have surrendered days ago. Commander Vorath stood before her, and he looked older than he had looked 3 days ago, and there were lines on his face that had not been there before. They do not fight like other species, Empress. He said, other species try to protect their cities, and their governments, and their important buildings, but the humans do not care about any of that, and they only care about hurting us, and they will sacrifice anything to do it. That is madness. Yes, Empress, it is madness, but it is effective madness. Zidara pulled up the data streams, showing human communications, and she saw something that made her blood run cold. The humans were not just fighting in the cities. They were fighting everywhere. Old woman in a small town had walked up to a Veltari patrol and smiled at them, and then detonated the explosives hidden under her. A group of children had thrown homemade firebombs at a supply convoy and destroyed 3 vehicles before disappearing. Into the woods, farmers were using their tractors and combines to block roads, and ambush patrol's office workers were using their computers to crash Veltari systems with viruses they had created in their spare time, and through it all the humans kept sending messages to each other, and the messages said things like never give up and remember what we are fighting for, and they will not take our homes. Ithara had studied human history before the invasion, and she had read about their wars and their conflicts, and she had dismissed most of it as primitive violence. But now she looked at that history again, and she saw something she had missed before. She saw Thermopylae, where 300 humans had stood against an army of millions and died to the last man rather than surrender. She saw the Alamo, where a small group of humans had fought to the death against impossible odds, and their defeat had inspired their people to ultimate victory. She saw Stalingrad, where humans had fought house to house and street to street and died by the millions, but never gave up. She saw a pattern, and the pattern terrified. Our humans did not fight to win, they fought because they could not stop fighting. It was in their blood, and in their bones, and in the very core of their being, and 10,000 years of warfare had bred them for this. And they were not soldiers, and they were not conquerors, and they were survivors. They had survived ice ages that had frozen their world. They had survived plagues that had killed half their population. They had survived famines and floods and fires and earthquakes, and they had survived each other, which was perhaps the most impressive thing of all, because humans had been killing humans for as long as there had been humans. They did not know how to give up. They did not know how to surrender, and they would not learn now. Empress Vorath said carefully, perhaps we should consider a different approach, and we could offer them terms and allow them to keep their governments in exchange for tribute and resources. They will not accept. Some of them might, and enough to make it worthwhile. Zidara shook her head. You do not understand what we have done, she said. We have killed their people, and we have threatened their children, and we have invaded their home, and they will never forgive. US for that, and they will never forget. And if we leave even one human alive on this planet, they will spend every day of their lives working toward our destruction. Then we destroy them all. Vorath said, "We burn the planet and end the threat." Zithara looked at him for a long moment. "With what?" she asked. "Have you seen our losses, and have you seen how quickly they learn, and every weapon we use becomes less effective as they develop? Countermeasures, and every tactic we try, they find a way to defeat, and our soldiers are afraid to fight them. Vorath and these are soldiers who have conquered 11 worlds." She stood from her throne and walked to the viewing screen and looked down. "At the blue planet below, I have made a terrible mistake," she said quietly. "I thought they were weak because they are small and short-lived and divided, but I was wrong, and their weakness is their strength, because they have been fighting each other for so long that they have become the greatest warriors in the galaxy, and we have just made enemies of them." Vorath was silent for a long time. "What do we do, Empress?" Zithara did not answer, because for the first time in 1,000 years, she did not know what to do. She had come to conquer a planet, but she had awakened something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Danny Reyes had not slept in 3 days, and his eyes were red, and his body was exhausted, but his spirit had never been stronger, and he stood in the ruins of downtown Chicago, surrounded by the people who had become his family. Pete Dawson was there. With his gray hair and his steel eyes and grace, Kim was there with her brilliant mind, and Howard Bell was there with his dangerous chemistry, and Linda Santos was there with her gentle hands that had saved so many lives, and there were hundreds of others who had joined them over the past 3 days. The alien ships still hung in the sky, but they were not landing troops anymore, and they were not attacking cities, and they were just sitting there waiting. Something has changed. Grace said, "I have been monitoring their communications, and they are scared, and they are arguing about what to do next." "What are they saying?" Pete asked. "The Empress is considering retreat, and her commanders are divided, and some want to stay and fight, and some want to leave and never come back." Danny looked up at the flagship hovering above them, and he felt something shift inside him. And it was the same feeling he had felt 3 days ago when he had taken that first step forward in the Veterans Hall. "We need to show them," he said. "We need to show them what they are dealing with." "How?" Linda asked. Danny thought about Lily, and he thought about the world she would inherit, and he thought about all the humans who had died in the past 3 days, and all the humans who had fought and sacrificed and refused to give up. "We gather everyone we can," he said, "and we go out there and we stand in front of them and we show them that we are not afraid." It was a crazy idea, and everyone knew it was crazy, but they did it anyway, because that was what humans did. Word spread through the resistance networks, and within hours, people began to gather in the streets of Chicago, and they came from everywhere. And they came on foot and in cars and on bicycles, and some of them crawled because they were too wounded to walk. They were not soldiers, and they were not armed, and they were just ordinary people. And there were men and women and children, and old people and young people, and they came from every background and every belief and every walk of life, and they stood together in the shadow of the alien flagship, and they looked up at the ship that had come to conquer them. Danny stood at the front of the crowd, and he felt the fire burning inside him brighter than ever before, and he opened his mouth, and he began to sing. It was a simple song, and it was a song about home, and it was a song about hope, and it was a song about never giving up no matter how hard things got. And one by one, the people around him began to sing too. The song spread through the crowd, and it spread through the city, and it spread through the world, as other humans in other places heard what was happening and joined in, and soon 8 billion humans were singing the same song aboard the Eternal Dominion. Empress Zithara stood at her viewing screen, and she watched the humans gather below. As she listened to them sing, as she felt something she had never felt in her 1,000 years of life, she felt fear of their weapons, because their weapons could not hurt her ship, not fear of their cleverness, Because she had the greatest minds in the galaxy working for her, she felt fear of what they were. Species that could lose everything and still sing. A species that could face destruction and still hope. A species that could be beaten and broken and burned and still take one more step forward. She thought about her empire, and she thought about the 11 worlds she had conquered, and she thought about what would happen if these humans ever truly reached the stars. They would come for her, not today, and not tomorrow, but someday they would come, and they would bring all the fury of a species that had learned to survive anything. And they would not stop until they had torn her empire apart, Commander Varath. She said, and her voice was quiet. Yes, Empress. Signal the fleet, and we are leaving. Empress, are you certain? I am certain, and we will place a warning beacon at the edge of this system, and the message will be simple, and it will say, do not invade Earth, and do not provoke the humans, and do not wake them. Varath stared at her. But the conquest is not worth the cost. Zidara said, I have seen what they are, and I have seen what they can do, and if we stay, we will eventually win, but we will lose too much in the winning. And then in 100 years or 1,000 years, they will break free, and they will come for us, and they will never stop coming. She turned from the screen and walked toward her chambers. They do not fight like other species, she said. Other species fight to live, but humans fight because they cannot imagine doing anything else, and it is who they are and what they are. What are they, Empress? She paused at the door and looked back at the planet one last time. Survivors, she said, and we have just taught them that they can survive us. The Velthri fleet departed Earth 3 hours later, and they did not look back, and they did not return. Danny stood in the streets of Chicago and watched the ships disappear into the sky, and he felt tears running down his face, and they were tears of joy and relief and pride. He drove to Maria's house as fast as he could, and Lily came running out to meet him, and he picked her up and held her tight, and he never wanted to let her go. Is it over, Daddy? She asked. Yes, sweetheart, it is over. But deep in his heart, Danny knew that it was not really over at all. It was just beginning. Humanity had faced an empire that had conquered 11 worlds, and they had made that empire retreat, and they had proven that they could not be conquered, and could not be broken, and could not be made to Neeland. Somewhere out there among the stars, other species had watched what happened, and they had learned something important about the small blue planet called Earth. They had learned to be afraid because one ordinary man had taken a single step forward, and the universe would never be the same.